Sometimes love doesn't end. It simply turns into a memory that can never be erased. Before starting, like and subscribe, it's very important to me. It was the summer of 1965. A bright sunny day when the air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the birds chirped as if they were trying to create the perfect melody for their meeting. Edward was only 22. Tall, fair-haired, with an open and sincere gaze, he was just beginning his adult life, working in a small bookstore in the heart of town. He was born and raised here, in a quiet American town where everyone knew each other. He had never dreamed of big changes, but that day became the moment that changed everything. Catherine entered the bookstore unexpectedly, skillfully pushing open the heavy wooden door. She wore a light blue dress that accentuated her slender waist, and her long chestnut hair cascaded over her shoulders in soft waves. Her green eyes scanned the bookshelves, and her lips parted slightly, as if she were searching for the right words. Edward noticed her instantly. The moment she stepped inside, everything around him seemed to freeze. He couldn't explain the feeling. It was something new, warm, and terrifying all at once. He had seen many girls before, but never had he felt anything like this. "Can I help you?" Edward asked, his voice hesitant at first. Catherine turned and smiled. That smile, warm and sincere, etched itself into his memory forever. "Yes," she replied. "I'm looking for Wuthering Heights. Do you happen to know where I can find it?" Edward nodded and, trying not to betray his nervousness, led her to the right shelf. She picked up the book, ran her fingers over its cover, and looked at him. "Have you read it?" she asked. "Yes. It's a story about passion that is stronger than time and circumstances," he said, feeling his heart beat faster. "I like the way you put that," she said with another smile. "Catherine." "Edward." He introduced himself, and they shook hands. From that day on, their paths began to cross more and more often. She would visit the bookstore under the pretense of buying new books, but would stay for hours, asking questions, talking about her favorite works. They walked in the park, sat in a small cafe on the corner, and talked for hours about books, about life, about dreams. Catherine turned out to be intelligent, lively, and a bit of a dreamer. She shared her desire to see the world, to travel to different countries, but for now she had to work as a secretary at a law firm to help support her family. Edward admired her determination and kindness. He realized he could no longer imagine his life without her. Weeks passed. Their meetings became more meaningful. They started writing letters to each other, not because they had to, but because it felt special. Catherine would leave little notes inside the books she borrowed, and Edward would reply, tucking messages between the pages of her favorite novels. One warm summer night, they sat on the roof of an old building, gazing at the stars. Their fingers brushed accidentally, but neither of them pulled away. "What do you dream about, Ed?" Catherine asked, looking at him with curiosity. "About being happy. About finding my place in life." He hesitated for a moment before adding, "About you." She looked at him, her eyes shimmering with emotion, and in that moment he knew. He had fallen in love completely and irrevocably. But happiness is rarely eternal. Edward had no idea that fate had already prepared a test for them, one that would change everything. They had spent it together, almost never apart, cherishing every moment, never thinking about tomorrow. Time moved slowly, as if allowing them to stretch these precious moments just a little longer. But sometimes Edward noticed something fleeting in Catherine's eyes, a trace of unease, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't bring herself to. He didn't dwell on it. Until that evening. They were sitting in their favorite cafe by the window, just as they always did. Catherine was quiet, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, avoiding his gaze. "You're acting strange today," Edward said, watching her closely. She sighed, then finally looked him in the eyes. "I got a letter." He waited. "It's a job offer. In California." Her words were gentle, but to him they felt like a blow. "California?" he repeated, as if he hadn't understood. She nodded. "It's a big opportunity for me, Ed. You know, I've always wanted to travel, to see the world." He nodded. Of course he knew. She had talked about it endlessly, about the city she wanted to visit, about the life she dreamed of building. He had always listened, always smiled, always supported her. But now it was no longer just a dream. It was real. Is it for a long time? His voice was hollow. I don't know, she admitted. A silence settled between them. Edward looked at her and realized that he was already losing her. He knew that Catherine had made her decision long before she had told him, not because she wanted to leave him, but because she had always been meant for something greater than this small town. What about us? He finally asked. She squeezed his hand tightly as if clinging to him. I'll write to you, I promise. We can make the distance work. Edward forced a smile. Of course, he said. But deep down he feared that distance always changed people. Time suddenly moved faster. Now every meeting, every conversation was soaked in the unspoken truth. They were saying goodbye, even if they didn't put it into words. They walked through the city streets, visited the bookstore. He bought her a book, Wuthering Heights, the very same one that had brought them together. So you won't forget me, he said, handing it to her. Catherine smiled, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. As if I ever could, Ed. He didn't reply. The train platform was crowded and noisy, but for Edward, only the two of them existed. She stood before him, suitcase in hand, her lips trembling. I'll come back, she whispered. He nodded. But he knew sometimes people leave forever even when they promise to return. As the train pulled away, Catherine looked at him through the window, and in her eyes, he saw everything: love, fear, regret. And then she was gone. Edward stood there, staring at the horizon where the train had disappeared. And he realized he was alone. The train station lingered in his mind for a long time. The scent of iron, the hum of voices, the warmth of her hand that had disappeared along with the final rhythm of the wheels against the tracks. He returned home, but the room felt unfamiliar. Everything was in its place, yet something had changed. He sat in his chair, staring at the wall. Everything inside him was filled with Catherine, books she had touched, her scarf, forgotten on the back of a chair, the faint scent of her perfume that still lingered in the air. A day passed, then another. He waited for a letter. Each time he checked the mailbox, he felt a foolish hope rise in his chest. And when, for the first time, he found a white envelope with her handwriting, his heart pounded faster. Ed, I made it. It's so sunny here, so different. The job is interesting, but I still have a lot to figure out. Think of you. I'll write again soon. See. Short but warm. It gave him hope. The letters arrived every week. At first they were long, full of emotions. She described how she was searching for a new apartment, the people around her, the ocean outside her window, the one she had always dreamed of seeing. Edward read those letters over and over. They were his only connection to her. But after a couple of months, something changed. The letters grew shorter. Now they arrived every 2 weeks. Then once a month. I'm sorry, work takes up all my time. How are you? I hope you're doing well. He could see her voice fading in the words. Not long ago, she had written with excitement, filling pages with every detail, every feeling. But now, only polite questions, only careful words. One evening, he sat at his desk and wrote her a long letter. He told her how much he missed her, how empty the city felt without her, how he still believed that everything was possible. He read it back to himself, then clenched it in his fist, and never sent it. Time passed. Edward continued working at the bookstore, continued walking the familiar streets, but he no longer stepped into their favorite cafe. Sometimes he sat by the window and watched people pass by. In every face he searched for hers. In every voice he thought he heard her laughter. But she never returned. He kept writing to her. His letters remained long, filled with thoughts and emotions. But her replies became shorter. Then one day, he received a letter with only a few lines. Ed, I'm so tired. Life here isn't what I expected. I miss you, but everything is changing. Those words were the beginning of the end. That night the phone rang. Edward grabbed it, his heartbeat quickening. Ed. Catherine's voice was quiet, distant. He smiled without realizing how tightly he was gripping the phone. Katie, how are you? She hesitated. I'm sorry I haven't written much. There's just so much happening, work takes up almost all my time. I understand, he said. forcing his voice to stay steady, but inside, everything clenched. I miss you, I really do. But, she trailed off. A cold chill ran down his spine. But what? I feel like everything is changing. Everything is so different. I still love you so much, but the distance. He closed his eyes, knowing exactly where this conversation was headed. So this is the end? His voice was rough. Catherine exhaled, her breath shaky. I don't know. I'm afraid we're just starting to live separate lives. Edward didn't speak. He had always known this was inevitable. But knowing was one thing. Accepting it was something else entirely. When the call ended, he sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the sound of rain tapping against the window. He had never felt so alone. He had promised to wait, promised to fight for their love. But what do you do when she had already started letting go? She hadn't left all at once. She hadn't severed everything in a single moment. She had faded from his life slowly, almost imperceptibly, leaving behind only emptiness. After that phone call, he kept writing her letters. Not because he expected an answer, but because he couldn't do otherwise. He wrote about his days, about the books he read, about how autumn had arrived in a city that felt so foreign without her. But at some point he realized he wasn't sending them. The letters remained in a drawer, neatly stacked, small fragments of his love that never found their way to her. Months passed, then years. Life went on, but Edward felt like a ghost in it. He worked at the bookstore, came home, reread old letters. Sometimes he caught himself wandering the streets, searching for her face among strangers. His friends tried to help. They told him he was still young, that he needed to move forward. One day, someone even introduced him to a woman, a kind, sweet girl. He tried. They went to the movies, talked about books. But when she laughed, he realized he was searching for Catherine and her. He never told her, but she knew. After a few meetings, she looked at him with a sad smile. You're still waiting for her, aren't you? He didn't answer. She walked away without looking back. And that's when he understood. No one could ever take Catherine's place. Edward still lived in the same town, in the same apartment. His life had become quiet and predictable. He worked, drank tea by the window, reread the letters he had never sent. Time had made him quieter. It hadn't taken the pain away, but it had taught him how to live with it. Sometimes, as he passed the mailbox, he still glanced inside. He no longer expected a letter, but he still hoped. One evening, as he was closing the bookstore, a man approached him, tall with streaks of gray in his hair, dressed in an expensive coat. Excuse me, are you Edward Miller? Yes, Edward replied, studying the stranger's face. The man smiled. My name is Richard Williams. We met many years ago. I knew Catherine. Edward felt something tighten inside him. That name. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years. Catherine? He repeated, as if unable to believe it. Richard nodded. Yes. I worked with her husband. Edward froze. Her husband. She was truly gone. Completely. Richard sighed, looking at him with quiet understanding. I know there was a lot between you. One day she told me about you. She said she sometimes thought about the past. Edward didn't know what to say. Inside him everything shifted. After Richard left, Edward sat in the dark for a long time, staring at an old envelope he had found among his papers. She hadn't written to him in years. But now he knew she remembered. She didn't regret. She didn't mourn. She simply remembered. He sighed, placed the letter back in the drawer and closed it. The silence in the room no longer felt so heavy. Edward didn't know when he had stopped waiting. Maybe it was the day he realized he checked the mailbox more out of habit than hope. Or perhaps when he noticed that he no longer reread her old letters before falling asleep. But even if he no longer waited, he still remembered. Years passed. He grew older. The city changed. One day he watched as they closed the bookstore where he had worked his entire life. The place where he had met her was now a cafe, where no one knew his name. 20 years went by. And then one day he heard her name. It was just another ordinary day. He was buying a newspaper at a small shop when a voice spoke. Catherine Brooks? Yes, of course I knew her. Edward froze. Behind the counter stood a man with gray hair and kind eyes. He recognized him instantly. Richard Williams. "Edward," Richard said in surprise. "My God, how many years has it been?" They stepped outside and sat on an old bench. "You were talking about Catherine," Edward finally said. Richard nodded. "Yes. She lived in California. She had a family, 2 children. She was happy." The word struck him unexpectedly. He had always known she had moved on. He had always known she probably had a husband, a home, children. But hearing it aloud, "Did she ever mention me?" he asked, staring at his hands. Richard hesitated. "Yes. Once many years ago. We were talking, and she said that sometimes she thought about the past." Edward nodded. He didn't know what he felt. Relief? Pain? Catherine hadn't forgotten him. But she hadn't regretted anything either. She had simply lived her life. Later, when he returned home, he sat by the window, watching the autumn rain for a long time. On the table before him lay an old note, one he had kept for years. "Have you ever seen the park after an autumn rain? It smells fresh, like something familiar. Autumn doesn't hide change. It simply accepts it." Edward smiled. She had always known that change was inevitable. Only he had refused to understand. Time moved forward, relentless and indifferent. Edward no longer waited for a letter. He no longer hoped to hear her voice. But the memory of Catherine still lived inside him. It was no longer pain as it had once been. Instead, it was a quiet, unchanging part of him, woven into his soul like an old, familiar melody. He was growing older. The world around him was changing. The city that had once felt like home now seemed unfamiliar. Strangers passed him by, young, happy, full of the kind of hope he had lost long ago. The bookstore where he had spent his life had closed years ago. A trendy boutique had taken its place. Edward walked past it every day but never stepped inside. He still lived in the same apartment, surrounded by the same books. Sometimes he felt like he had become an old object himself, something forgotten, unnoticed, something that would simply vanish one day without anyone realizing. Each day began the same. He woke early, put the kettle on, and sat by the window watching the world wake up. He loved watching people. Sometimes, among the passing strangers, he thought he caught a familiar glimpse. He imagined, just for a moment, that she would turn the corner, wearing that light blue dress, her smile the same as it had always been. But it was just a trick of memory. He rarely spoke to anyone. The neighbors knew him as the quiet old man who always nodded politely but never joined their conversations. One day, at the grocery store, a young girl smiled at him and asked, "How are you?" Edward froze. He wanted to say, "I'm fine," but then he realized, no one had asked him that in a very long time. "It's the same as always," he said softly. She nodded and walked away. And he stood there for a few more moments, feeling something strange stir inside him. On a cool autumn day, he went for a walk. As he reached the bus stop, someone called his name. "Edward." He turned. Standing before him was Richard. The same Richard who had spoken to him about Catherine all those years ago. "I never thought I'd run into you again," Richard said with a smile. They walked together for a few blocks, their conversation slow and measured. Richard spoke about his children, his life, until suddenly he said, "Did you hear? Catherine, she's gone." Edward felt his heart skip a beat. He didn't ask how or when. It didn't matter. They stood in silence. Richard added that she had passed peacefully, surrounded by her family. Edward nodded. He had always known this day would come. That night he couldn't sleep. He reached for an old box filled with letters and, just as he had done so many times before, unfolded one. "I miss those days, Ed. Sometimes I wonder, what if things had turned out differently?" He read the words again, then carefully folded the letter back. Old men rarely cry. But that night he let himself. He didn't know if he had ever truly let her go. But he knew one thing. His love had never faded. Not ever. Edward woke earlier than usual. Pale morning light seeped through the curtains, painting the room in soft shades of gray. The air was crisp with the first touch of autumn chill. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the street below. It had been weeks since he had learned about Catherine. first he tried not to think about it. The habit of living in memories was too deeply ingrained in him. But now every time he closed his eyes he saw her face, her smile, heard her voice. One morning he realized he had to do what he had avoided his entire life, go to the place where she had spent her last years. Perhaps it was the only way to finally close the chapter of a story that had long since ceased to be his present. The trip was long. He sat by the train window watching the autumn landscape rush past. Every now and then, his fingers brushed against the inside pocket of his jacket, where he kept one of her old letters. That same piece of paper he had cherished for decades. He knew every word, every comma by heart. But now it felt important to carry it with him, as a reminder of why he had come. When the train arrived, Edward felt a strange sense of anticipation. This city was unfamiliar, yet he had imagined it countless times. He walked through the narrow streets, studying the buildings with quiet reverence. Which one had she lived in? On which balcony had she stood in the mornings with a cup of coffee? How often had she looked toward the ocean, and had she ever thought of him in those moments? He didn't dare ask anyone about her. His life had been tied to hers, but hers had long since taken a different path. People here might remember her, but not as the Catherine he had known. It would be like looking into a life that was never meant to include him. But he knew exactly where to go. The ocean. She had always said she wanted to live near it, that her dream was to wake up every morning to the sound of the waves. He walked slowly, the autumn breeze cool against his face. In the distance the horizon shimmered, a silver line stretching endlessly into the unknown. When he reached the shore, he noticed a small bench near the water's edge. He sat down, staring at the horizon, and only then did he realize just how tired he was. Inside him burned something unfamiliar, a mix of longing, regret, and surprisingly relief. He imagined her sitting here, looking at the water, smiling at something in her thoughts. Had she ever thought of him? The wind ruffled his graying hair, carrying the scent of salt and thyme. He closed his eyes, breathing it in deeply. For the first time he felt like he had finally arrived where he was always meant to be. That evening he went to the cemetery. He searched among the rows of marble stones until he found her name. When he did, his knees almost gave way beneath him. He stood before the gravestone, unsure of what to say. Everything he had held inside him for years suddenly felt unimportant. She was gone, but she remained within him. In his memory, in every letter, in every autumn morning, in every glance at the books she had once loved. He sat on the nearby bench and simply listened to the wind. "Thank you, Katie," he whispered. He wasn't sure if he was thanking her for her love, or for the memories she had left behind. But in that moment he understood. The pain that had followed him for so long had finally begun to fade. She would always be a part of him, but she would no longer be his sorrow. He spent hours there. Then as the sky darkened, he stood and walked back toward town. As he passed by a bookstore, something made him stop. In the window, a familiar title caught his eye, Wuthering Heights. He stepped inside, picked up the book, and ran his fingers over the cover. How many years had it been since he had first heard her voice, asking about this very story? He bought the book and stepped outside. For a moment he hesitated, then opened it to the first page and smiled. She had always said that books were a bridge between the past and the future. Perhaps at last he had taken his first step across that bridge. The next morning he left the city. As the train carried him home, he felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. His love for Catherine would never fade. But now it had changed. It was no longer a chain that bound him to the past. It was something warm, something that filled the present with quiet meaning. And as the train pulled away, he took one last look at the ocean. For the first time in a long time he was not alone. Edward returned home late in the evening. The city greeted him with its usual silence. Streetlights cast a dim glow over the empty sidewalks, and from somewhere far away, the muffled sound of a radio drifted through an open window. He stepped into his apartment, removed his coat, and carefully hung it on the rack. The air carried the familiar scent of old books, mixed with the crisp freshness of autumn that clung to his clothes from outside. He walked to his chair by the window, the place where he had spent countless evenings watching the world beyond the glass. On the table before him lay the book he had bought in Catherine's city. He opened it, running his fingers over the pages the way she once had. It was a strange feeling, to hold something that connected him to the past while also gently pushing him forward. Several days had passed since his trip. Now there was no more emptiness, no more burning ache in his chest that had haunted him for years. The pain had faded, leaving behind something else. A quiet gratitude. He no longer reread her letters. They remained with him, but he no longer needed them to remember. She lived not in ink and paper but in him, in his thoughts, in small details, in the autumn air, in the morning light, in the sound of pages turning in a book. One day he went for a walk. The day was cold but sunny. He reached the old park, the same one where he had once walked with Catherine. He sat on a bench and closed his eyes. The wind played with the fallen leaves, and the sun cast a gentle warmth on his face. Young couples strolled past, children laughed, someone read a book on a nearby bench. Life moved on, and he was still a part of it. The next morning, he woke up feeling lighter than he had in years. He opened a window, letting in the crisp air, and suddenly felt the urge to do something he hadn't done in a long time. He picked up a piece of paper and a pen, and he began to write. Not to Catherine. Not about the past, but about life, about today, about what he saw outside his window, about a thought that had crossed his mind. He sat for a long time, staring at the words written by his slightly trembling hand. They were simple, but they carried no sadness, only honesty and acceptance. For the first time in years he felt truly alive. That evening he decided to walk a little longer than usual. Perhaps he would stop by the cafe where he and Catherine had once spent their evenings. Not to mourn, but simply to remember. As the sun began to set, he brewed tea, sat by the window, and looked out at the city. He knew there were still many days ahead of him. Perhaps they wouldn't be significant or filled with grand events. But now he was ready to live them, not just watch them pass. The past would always be with him, but it no longer held him back. It had become a part of him, something that carried him forward rather than pulling him down. That evening he closed the book, placed it on the shelf, and smiled. He was no longer alone. The next morning, Edward woke up early, feeling more refreshed than usual. He made breakfast, placed an old cup on the table, the one he had once shared tea with Catherine. But now it wasn't a ritual of remembrance. It was simply a part of his life, a life that continued. He stepped outside, inhaling the crisp morning air. Autumn was deepening. The leaves crunched beneath his feet, whispering the echoes of the past. Ahead of him was a new day, and he was ready to meet it. Edward walked into a bookstore, not because he was looking for anything special, but because he wanted to feel surrounded by stories, by words, by people. As he wandered through the aisles, he noticed a young woman browsing the shelves. Without thinking, he stepped closer and said gently, "If you're looking for something special, try this one." He pointed to Wuthering Heights. She smiled, nodding in gratitude. And in that moment he realized, when he spoke the title aloud, he hadn't thought of Catherine's voice. And that was a good thing. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button, so you don't miss more heartwarming stories.